The water stopped mid-shower, not with a warning, not with a sputter, but with a sudden, mocking silence that left me standing there, dripping soap and disbelief, when my phone buzzed with an email from the HOA cheerfully titled Final Notice, NON Payment. I laughed at first because it felt like a joke so badly written it had to be satire. Then I realized my house had no running water, my weekend guests were arriving in 6 hours, and someone with a clipboard had decided they could turn my life off like a switch. I wrapped myself in a towel and stood in the kitchen staring at the sink as if it might apologize and start working again. Nothing. No gurgle. No pressure. Just dead pipes and that hollow echo you only notice when something essential is missing. I opened the email properly this time. According to the HOA, I had failed to pay my water bill for 3 months. According to my bank app, I had paid every single utility on time, including water, directly to the municipal provider. According to reality, someone was lying, and they were confident enough to shut off my water to prove a point. I called the number at the bottom of the email. It rang twice before a woman answered with the kind of bright authority that only comes from someone who thinks rules are personality trait. She introduced herself as the HOA compliance officer and spoke slowly, like she was explaining something obvious to a child. She told me water service was a community-controlled utility and that my failure to pay the HOA directly had consequences. I asked her when the HOA had become the city. She didn't laugh. She told me if I wanted my water restored, I needed to pay the outstanding balance plus a reconnection fee. I asked her how much. She gave me a number that was higher than my actual city water bill and said it without hesitation, like she'd practiced it. I told her I paid the city, not the HOA. She paused for half a second, then said, "That's incorrect. Our association owns the meter servicing your property." That was the moment my confusion turned into something sharper. I bought this house 5 years ago. I remembered the inspection. I remembered the utility walkthrough. I remembered the meter sitting out near the road, tagged, numbered, city stamp. I also remembered the HOA paperwork being very clear about what they controlled and what they absolutely did not. Landscaping, parking, exterior paint shades that all looked identical anyway. They had never mentioned owning water infrastructure. Not once. I told her she was wrong. She told me the board had voted. I told her voting didn't magically transfer property rights. She told me if I continued to be difficult, the water would remain off indefinitely. Her voice carried a small, satisfied edge, like this was the part of the job she enjoyed most. After the call ended, I sat at my kitchen table in a towel and tried to breathe through the anger. The house felt different without water. Too quiet. Too dry. Like it was holding its breath. I texted my neighbor to ask if her water was working. She replied instantly, confused, saying hers was fine. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a system issue. This was targeted. I drove down to the meter box by the road. The cover was open. A bright red tag hung from the valve like a warning label. Private shutoff authorized. I knelt down and took photos from every angle. The meter had the city seal. The serial number matched my last bill. There was no HOA marking anywhere. Whoever shut this off had done it physically, manually, and confidently wrong. By noon, my phone was full of messages from the HOA group chat. Someone had noticed my water was off and decided it was a teaching moment. One message said rules apply to everyone. Another said maybe this will encourage compliance. No one asked if there had been a mistake. They assumed guilt like it was their job. I called the city water department. The woman on the line sounded tired but competent. She pulled up my account and confirmed my payments were current. She confirmed the meter was city-owned. Then she paused and asked me to repeat what I'd said about the shutoff. When I told her an HOA representative had turned my water off, her tone changed. She asked if I could email photos. I sent them immediately. 10 minutes later, she called back and told me something that made my stomach flip in a very specific way. The city had not authorized any shutoff. No notice. No work order. No record. Which meant someone had tampered with municipal infrastructure without permission. She said it carefully, but I heard what she wasn't saying. This wasn't an HOA dispute anymore. This was a legal problem. She told me they would send a technician to restore service, but she also said something else. She said the city took unauthorized meter interference very seriously. I thanked her and hung up, already feeling the shape of where this was going. When the HOA compliance officer called me back that afternoon, her tone had changed just a little. She told me the board was willing to waive the reconnection fee as a courtesy if I paid the outstanding balance today. I asked her why the city water department was calling this an illegal shutoff. Silence. Then she said the board would review the matter internally. I told her not to bother. By the time the city truck pulled up, half the neighborhood was watching. The technician popped the meter box, looked at the tag, and sighed. He shook his head in that slow, professional way that says someone has made his day worse by being stupid. He turned the valve, restored the water, and handed me a printed notice stating the meter was city property and any future interference would result in fines and potential criminal charges. I didn't smile. Not yet. That evening, another email went out from the HOA. It said there had been a misunderstanding regarding water billing authority, and that residents should continue paying utilities as originally instructed. No apology. No explanation. Just a quiet retreat, like they could erase the day by pretending it never happened. But they couldn't erase the photos, or the city report, or the fact that they had confidently shut off something they never owned. And they definitely couldn't erase the paper trail they just created. As I turned on my shower again that night, water rushing back like nothing had happened, I realized this wasn't over. Not even close. Because people who grab power they don't stop when they're caught. They stop when they're forced. And now I knew exactly where to push. The next morning, the HOA acted like nothing had happened, which somehow made everything worse. I woke up to running water and a tight jaw, the kind that comes from clenching your teeth all night without realizing it. My phone already had 3 new emails from the association. One was a generic reminder about trash bins. Another was a notice about lawn edging standard. The third was a meeting agenda for an emergency board session scheduled for that evening. Water wasn't mentioned once. That silence wasn't an accident. It was strategy. I made coffee and sat at the table with my laptop open, pulling up every document I had from when I bought the house. Closing papers, utility disclosures, HOA bylaws, amendments, addendums. The stack was thick enough to qualify as a doorstop, but I remembered exactly what I was looking for. The section where the HOA loved to list what it controlled. Fences, signage, exterior lighting brightness. Even the acceptable color temperature for porch bulbs, which was somehow a thing. Water infrastructure wasn't there. I searched for the word meter. Nothing. Utility. Nothing. Municipal. Nothing. The HOA had authority over exactly 0 pieces of anything underground. That didn't stop them from acting like they just discovered a new toy. Around 10, my neighbor from across the street walked over. She held her phone out in front of her like it might bite. She asked me, very quietly, if it was true the HOA could shut off water now. I told her no. I told her what they did was illegal. Her shoulders dropped in visible relief, followed immediately by anger. She said the compliance officer had been going door to door that morning, reminding people to pay the HOA directly to avoid disruptions. That's when it clicked. This wasn't about me missing a payment. This was a test. They picked a house, shut off the water, made a show of it, then used the fear to push everyone else into line. It was clumsy, but it was bold. And bold only works when no one pushes back. I asked my neighbor if she'd heard them claim ownership of the meters. She nodded and said they'd told her the board had acquired control as part of a recent infrastructure update. She used air quotes when she said update. I asked if she'd seen paperwork. She laughed. That laugh carried more nerves than humor. By noon, the HOA group chat was buzzing again, but now the tone had shifted. Instead of smug certainty, there was confusion layered with irritation. Someone asked why the city truck had been on my street. Someone else said it was probably routine maintenance. The compliance officer chimed in to say the situation was being handled and residents should not contact outside agencies without board approval. That last line made my fingers curl. I forwarded the city notice to myself again, just to feel it sitting there. Black and white. Clear language. Unauthorized interference. Municipal property. Penalties. The HOA had crossed a line they didn't even know existed, and now they were trying to pretend the line was imaginary. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 7. Attendance mandatory for homeowners. That alone was a red flag. HOA meetings were usually optional unless they were raising fees. Mandatory meant they wanted control of the room. Narrative first. Questions later. Or never. I showed up early and sat in the back. The board members filtered in wearing the same confident smiles they always did, the kind that suggested they thought authority was contagious. The compliance officer took a seat near the front with a binder thick enough to be theatrical. When the meeting started, the president cleared his throat and launched straight into a speech about community cohesion and shared responsibility. He talked for 10 minutes without saying anything concrete. Then he finally brought up water. He said there had been confusion regarding billing channels. He said the board had acted in good faith based on outdated information. He said the shutoff was temporary and corrective, not punitive. He said the HOA was reviewing its policies to ensure clarity going forward. I raised my hand. He hesitated, then nodded like he was granting a favor. I asked him to explain how the HOA had come to believe it owned a city-issued water meter. I asked him to specify which document transferred that ownership. I asked him who authorized physical access to municipal equipment. Each question landed heavier than the last. He didn't answer any of them. Instead, he said the board would address individual concerns privately and moved on to the next agenda item. A few people looked uncomfortable. A few looked relieved. One woman near the front nodded along like this all made perfect sense. After the meeting, the compliance officer cornered me in the hallway. Her voice was low and tight. She told me I was being disruptive. She said involving the city had been unnecessary. She said the board expected cooperation, not confrontation. I told her the city expected their infrastructure not to be tampered with. She stared at me for a long second, then said something that told me everything about how this was going to go. She said, "You should be careful. Not everyone appreciates troublemakers." That night, I received a violation notice. It wasn't about water. It was about my driveway. Apparently, the edge encroached 2 inches beyond the approved boundary. A boundary that hadn't moved in 5 years. The fine was small, but the message was loud. If they couldn't shut off my water, they'd find something else. I paid nothing. I documented everything. Because retaliation is only effective when the other side doesn't know how to keep records. And I was done pretending this was just an HOA being annoying. They had tried to control something they didn't own. Now they were trying to punish me for proving it. And that was a much bigger mistake than shutting off my shower. By the 3rd day, the HOA had stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding. The driveway violation was followed by another notice before lunch. This one claimed my exterior hose bib violated community aesthetics because it was visible from the street. I stared at the email for a long moment, then actually laughed out loud. The hose connection had been there since the house was built. It had passed inspection. It was standard. Beige. Boring. The only thing offensive about it was that it still worked. That was the pattern now. If they couldn't win on facts, they'd bury me in noise. I took the day off work and treated the situation like a project, because that's what it had become. I created a folder on my laptop labeled HOA Water Incident and started dumping everything into it. Emails, screenshot, photos of the meter, the city notice, the violation letters. I saved the group chat messages where they bragged about enforcement. I time-stamped everything. I backed it up twice. By mid-afternoon, I noticed something else. A city utility truck parked down the block. Different logo this time. 2 men standing near the storm drain, talking, looking at a tablet. One of them pointed toward my house. I walked over before the HOA could decide I wasn't allowed to exist outdoors without permission. They weren't there for me directly. Not yet. One of them asked if I lived in the house with the recent unauthorized shutoff. When I said yes, he nodded and said they were doing a broader review. Apparently, once the city flagged the incident, it triggered an internal audit of utility access across the neighborhood. They wanted to know if anyone else had been touched. They wanted to know how the HOA had gotten access to the meter in the first place. That question hung between us. I told them the meter box had never been locked. City standard. I told them HOA representatives regularly walked the streets during compliance check. I told them exactly who had spoken to me on the phone and what she'd claimed. They wrote everything down. Carefully. When they left, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't an email. It was a certified letter notification. The HOA was demanding payment for 3 months of community water service, plus administrative penalties. They'd attached a spreadsheet. It was impressively detailed for something completely fictional. I drove to the HOA office. The compliance officer was there, sitting behind her desk like a gatekeeper to an imaginary kingdom. She didn't look surprised to see me. She looked annoyed, like I was interrupting something important. I placed the certified notice on her desk and asked her to explain it. She told me the HOA had entered into an agreement to manage water billing internally. I asked with whom. She said with the board. I asked if the city was involved. She said the city's role was operational, not authoritative. That was when I realized she either didn't understand how utilities worked or didn't care. I told her the city had initiated an audit. Her eyes flicked, just for a second. That was the first crack. She told me the HOA would handle any communication with outside entities, and that homeowners were not permitted to interfere. I told her homeowners were permitted to call the city when someone shut off their water illegally. Her voice hardened. She said the board would pursue enforcement if I continued to be uncooperative. I asked her if she understood what retaliation looked like on paper. She told me I was welcome to consult legal counsel. So I did. That afternoon, I sat in a small office with a lawyer who specialized in municipal dispute. I didn't have to explain much. I showed him the photos, the city notice, the emails, the certified demand. He leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath that wasn't relief. He said the HOA had no authority over the meter. He said unauthorized shutoffs were serious. He said retaliation through selective enforcement was a textbook mistake. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting for. Did anyone else lose water? I told him not that I knew of. He nodded and said that almost made it worse. Targeting one homeowner made intent easier to prove. He told me to stop responding directly to the HOA and route everything through him. He told me to keep documenting. He told me not to pay a cent. That evening, another message hit the group chat. The HOA president announced that all homeowners must submit proof of water payment to the association within 5 days to ensure compliance. Several people pushed back immediately. Someone asked why this was suddenly required. Someone else mentioned the city notice circulating quietly through text messages. The compliance officer responded with a long paragraph about authority and order. Then someone posted a photo of their meter. City seal visible. Serial number clear. Another neighbor followed. Then another. Within minutes, the chat was full of evidence the HOA couldn't erase. Every meter looked the same. Every one belonged to the city. The confidence drained out of the room digitally, message by message. The compliance officer deleted the thread. That didn't help. Because screenshots exist. And now the HOA wasn't just dealing with me. They were dealing with a neighborhood that had started asking the wrong questions. Late that night, my lawyer emailed me. The city had contacted him directly. They wanted copies of everything. They were escalating the review. Not just for unauthorized access, but for misrepresentation of authority. I stared at the screen for a long time. The HOA thought water was leverage. They thought fear would keep people quiet. What they didn't understand was that once you turn something essential off, you don't just create compliance. You create witnesses. And by the end of the third day, they were everywhere. By the fourth day, the HOA stopped emailing me directly. Everything started coming through my lawyer, which was their first smart move and also their last. The tone shifted immediately. Where the earlier messages had been smug and threatening, these were cautious, bloated with legal language, and clearly written by someone who had Googled phrases like good faith and administrative oversight at 3 in the morning. It didn't matter. The damage was already moving faster than they were. The city audit became visible in ways the HOA couldn't control. Utility crews started showing up in pairs, not to fix anything but to look. They opened meter boxes. They checked seals. They photographed valves. They logged access points. Neighbors noticed. Questions spread. Fear changed direction. I stood in my driveway when one of the inspectors walked over and asked if I'd be willing to give a formal statement. Not a complaint. A statement. The word carried weight. I invited him inside and watched as he laid out forms on my kitchen table, right where I'd been sitting in a towel 3 days earlier, staring at a dead sink. He asked me to recount everything in order. I did. Date, times, names, exact phrases. He nodded occasionally, not reacting, just absorbing. When I finished, he flipped to the last page and asked if anyone from the HOA had contacted me after the city restored service. I told him about the violations. I told him about the payment demand. I told him about the warning to be careful. That was when he stopped writing. He looked up and said retaliation following an unauthorized utility shutoff escalated the situation significantly. He didn't say illegal. He didn't have to. He asked me to sign the statement. I did, slow and deliberate. That afternoon, the HOA president knocked on my door. I almost didn't answer. Almost. But curiosity won. He stood there without his usual smile, holding a folder that looked heavier than it needed to be. He said he wanted to clear the air. He said the board valued harmony. He said things had moved faster than intended. He said mistakes were made on both sides. I told him there was no both sides when it came to shutting off water you didn't own. He flinched just slightly. He asked if I'd consider resolving the matter internally. He said the board could withdraw the violations. He said they could offer a goodwill credit. He said involving the city further would only complicate things for everyone. I asked him why the compliance officer had told residents the HOA owned the meters. He said she'd misspoken. I asked him why they demanded payment after the city confirmed ownership. He said it was a billing transition issue. I asked him why the violations appeared only after I challenged them. He said enforcement schedules varied. Each answer sounded thinner than the last. When he finished, I told him I was no longer discussing this without my lawyer present. I told him the city was already involved. I told him they should be more concerned about that than about me. He left without shaking my hand. That evening, the first formal letter arrived from the city. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to the HOA. Someone had slipped a copy under my door. It stated that the city was opening an investigation into unauthorized access and misrepresentation of municipal utilities. It requested documentation supporting any claim of ownership or management authority over water meters within the association boundaries. It set a deadline. It listed penalties for non-compliance. The group chat exploded. People who had stayed quiet before were suddenly loud. They wanted to know what the HOA had done. They wanted to know if their water was safe. They wanted to know why the board had claimed authority it didn't have. The compliance officer tried to calm things down, but her messages were drowned out. Someone posted the city letter. Someone else posted a screenshot of the HOA's earlier claim about meter ownership. You could feel the shift. The spell was breaking. The next violation notice hit my inbox just after midnight. This one accused me of unauthorized communication with external agencies. That was when my lawyer stepped in properly. By morning, the HOA received a cease and desist letter accusing them of harassment, retaliation, and interference with essential services. It demanded all enforcement actions against me be paused. It demanded preservation of records. It demanded no further contact outside legal channels. The HOA responded with silence. Then, late that afternoon, a city utility supervisor showed up with 2 uniformed officers. They didn't knock on my door. They went straight to the HOA office. I watched from my porch as neighbors gathered, pretending not to stare while staring very hard. The officers went inside. The door closed. An hour passed. Then 2. When they came out, one of them carried a box. The compliance officer followed behind, pale and furious, talking too fast to be heard. The box went into the city truck. No one explained what was inside, but rumors spread anyway. Access logs, internal memos, maybe keys, maybe all of it. The HOA president didn't reappear. That night, another email went out to the community. Short, careful. It said the board was cooperating fully with a city review and that all utility-related enforcement was suspended pending clarification. No apologies, no ownership of what they'd done. But fear had changed sides now. Because when authorities start removing boxes, it means they're done asking nicely. And I had the sinking feeling that shutting off my water was only the smallest mistake they were about to pay for. By the 5th day, the HOA stopped using words like misunderstanding. They switched to words like pause and review and clarification, the verbal equivalent of backing away from a fire while insisting you were never standing that close to begin with. The problem was, everyone had already felt the heat. The neighborhood woke up to orange door hangers stamped with a city seal. Not citations. Notices. Informational, technically. But nothing makes people nervous like a city logo and the phrase municipal inquiry printed in bold at the top. Each notice explained that the city was conducting a review of unauthorized access to water infrastructure and that residents might be contacted for statements. Statements. Plural. My phone didn't stop buzzing. Neighbors wanted to know what to say, what not to say, whether they were in trouble, whether their water could be shut off next. I told them the truth. The city wasn't investigating homeowners. It was investigating whoever thought they could act like a utility company without being one. That distinction mattered. Calmed some people. It terrified others. Around mid-morning, my lawyer called and told me the city had formally requested all HOA records related to utilities, billing, enforcement actions, and communications for the past 18 months. Emails, meeting minutes, internal memos, payment logs, anything even tangentially related to water. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded impressed. He also told me something else. The city had identified a second unauthorized meter access in the neighborhood. Different house. Same red tag. Same handwriting. That was the moment the story stopped being about me entirely. The second homeowner hadn't even known it happened. Their water hadn't been shut off long enough to notice. The HOA had tagged the meter and then backed off. A test run. Or a threat. Either way, it proved intent. This wasn't a single overzealous compliance officer. This was a pattern. By noon, the HOA website went offline. That didn't go unnoticed. Someone in the group chat joked that they were probably updating the bylaws to include ownership of the sun next. Someone else wasn't joking at all when they asked if the board could be arrested. Fear and humor lived uncomfortably close together now. The compliance officer finally broke her silence with a mass email that read like it had been rewritten 10 times by 3 different people. It claimed the HOA had relied on inaccurate third-party information. It said no resident accounts had been altered. It said the board was cooperating fully. It did not explain why meters had been physically accessed. People weren't buying it anymore. That afternoon, the city inspector who'd taken my statement returned. This time, he wasn't alone. He brought a woman from the municipal legal department. She didn't waste time on small talk. She asked me one question. Had the HOA ever provided written notice claiming ownership of the meter before the shutoff? I told her no. I told her the first time I'd heard that claim was when my water was already off. She nodded and made a note. Then she asked if I still had the email. I forwarded it to her on the spot. She thanked me and stood up. Before she left, she said something quietly, almost conversational. She said misrepresentation of municipal authority carries penalties that increase sharply when used to extract payment. She said repeated access without authorization suggested willful misconduct. She said retaliation following exposure was its own issue entirely. She didn't say what would happen next. She didn't need to. That evening, a notice was posted at the HOA office. Physical paper. City seal. It informed the board that pending the outcome of the investigation, all HOA interaction with utility infrastructure was prohibited. Any further interference would result in immediate enforcement action. Someone took a photo and posted it everywhere. The HOA president finally resurfaced in the group chat, trying to regain control with a long message about unity and patience. He asked residents not to speculate. He asked for trust. He asked for time. No one responded. Because trust is hard to rebuild when you've been caught turning off people's water. Later that night, my lawyer forwarded me a draft of something he called a courtesy preview. It was a potential civil complaint the city was preparing in case the HOA failed to comply fully. Unauthorized access, fraudulent billing, abuse of authority. Each line felt heavier than the last. He asked me if I was willing to be named. I said yes without hesitation, because this had stopped being about inconvenience or fees or ego. This was about power. About who thought they could control essentials just because they wore a badge with the word association on it. As I went to bed, I realized something that made sleep difficult. The HOA had wanted compliance. Instead, they had triggered scrutiny. And scrutiny, once it starts, doesn't shut off nearly as easily as water. By the sixth day, the HOA started losing people. Not residents, board members. It began quietly, the way these things always do. A resignation email sent late at night, short and careful, citing personal reasons. Then another the next morning, this one longer, full of vague language about priorities and stepping back. By lunchtime, 2 board seats were empty, and no one was volunteering to fill them. Authority looks solid right up until the moment it doesn't. The group chat changed tone again. Where there had been anger and fear, there was now something closer to opportunism. People asked whether dues could be reduced. Someone wondered out loud if past fines had been legitimate. Another asked how many other rules had been enforced without proper authority. The questions stacked on top of each other, unanswered. The HOA president tried to hold a special meeting. Virtual this time. Optional attendance. Only 5 people showed up, and 3 of them had their cameras off. He spoke into the void for 15 minutes before ending it early, citing technical difficulties. The recording never got posted. Meanwhile, the city wasn't slowing down. Utility crews returned, this time with laminated badges and clipboards. They knocked on doors. They asked homeowners if anyone from the HOA had ever mentioned water billing changes. If anyone had been told to pay the association instead of the city. If anyone had seen red tags on meters. The answers varied, but the pattern didn't. Yes, someone had said something. Yes, it sounded official. No, there was no paperwork. No, it didn't feel right. My lawyer called in the afternoon with a tone I'd never heard from him before. Not cautious. Not analytical. Almost amused. He told me the HOA's legal counsel had reached out, asking to discuss resolution options. Not demands. Not threats. Options. That alone said everything. He asked me what I wanted. I told him I wanted the truth on record. I wanted the violations rescinded permanently. I wanted a written acknowledgement that the HOA had no authority over water infrastructure. I wanted assurance it wouldn't happen again. He paused, then said those were reasonable. Then he added something I hadn't asked for. He said the city was considering administrative penalties against individual actors, not just the organization. That's when I understood why people were resigning. Power feels collective until consequences become personal. That evening, the compliance officer showed up at my door. She looked different. Not angry. Not confident. Smaller somehow. She asked if we could talk. I told her any conversation went through my lawyer. She nodded and said she understood. Then she said something I didn't expect. She said she'd been told the meters were community property. She said she'd trusted that information. She said she'd never intended for things to escalate. Her voice shook just enough to be noticeable. I believed that she believed herself. I told her intent didn't change outcome. I told her turning off someone's water wasn't a training error. I told her she should speak to her own counsel. She left without arguing. The next morning, a notice appeared on the HOA website when it finally came back online. It announced the immediate suspension of the compliance officer pending investigation. No explanation. No thanks. Just a clean cut. The board was eating itself now. Behind the scenes, my lawyer forwarded me excerpts from depositions the city had already begun taking. Board members contradicting each other. Emails where authority was assumed but never verified. Messages where someone joked about how fast people fell in line when water was involved. That line sat in my chest like a stone. They hadn't just crossed a line. They'd tested it for weakness. By late afternoon, the city issued a preliminary finding. It wasn't public yet, but we had a copy. Unauthorized access confirmed. No ownership established. Misrepresentation likely. Enforcement actions under review. Potential penalties pending. The HOA president emailed the community that night. Shorter than usual. He said the board accepted responsibility for procedural errors. He said corrective measures were underway. He said they hoped to rebuild trust. No one replied. Because trust isn't rebuilt with emails when people have watched power get abused in real time. As I turned off the lights, I thought about how quickly control had slipped from their hand. How a single shutoff had unraveled years of assumed authority. How fragile the illusion had been all along. They thought water was leverage. They never considered what would happen when the flow came back and everyone started paying attention. By the seventh day, the HOA stopped pretending this was fixable with statements and suspensions. They went quiet. No emails. No posts. No updates. The website froze on the same generic announcement about cooperation and review. The group chat, once moderated into polite compliance, turned into something else entirely. Threads stayed open. Screenshots stayed up. People started comparing notes, not just about water, but about everything. Parking fines issued without warnings. Landscaping violations enforced selectively. Late fees that never appeared in the bylaws. Patterns emerged where none had been visible before. The water shutoff hadn't been an isolated abuse. It had just been the most visible one. The city made its move mid-morning. An official notice went out to every homeowner, not from the HOA, but directly from the Municipal Utilities Department. It confirmed that all water meters in the community were city-owned. It stated clearly that no HOA had authority to access, restrict, bill, or interfere with service. It warned residents to report any future attempts immediately. Clear. Public. Unavoidable. That single email did more damage to the HOA's credibility than everything else combined. It stripped away the ambiguity they'd relied on. There was no room left for interpretation. Anyone who still believed the board had acted in good faith was now doing it out of loyalty, not evidence. My lawyer called me an hour later. He said the city had finalized its enforcement recommendations. He said they were substantial. He said the HOA had been offered a chance to settle administratively to avoid criminal referral, but only if they accepted fault, paid penalties, and agreed to oversight conditions. He asked if I was ready. I told him I'd been ready since the shower went cold. That afternoon, the HOA president requested mediation. Not demanded. Requested. He wanted to meet with my lawyer, the city's legal representative, and me, in a conference room downtown. Neutral ground. He wanted closure. The room felt too small for the weight of it. The city lawyer laid out the findings calmly. Unauthorized shutoff. False claims of ownership. Attempted collection of funds under misrepresented authority. Retaliatory enforcement. Each point landed without drama. It didn't need any. The HOA president tried to explain. He talked about confusion. He talked about bad advice. He talked about pressure to enforce compliance. The city lawyer listened, then asked one question. Why did you shut off the water before verifying ownership? There was no good answer. There wasn't even a bad one that worked. When it was my turn, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I described standing in my kitchen with no water. I described the threat to leave it off indefinitely. I described the violations that followed. I described the fear spreading through the neighborhood. I described the moment trust broke. I didn't embellish. I didn't accuse. I just told the truth. The settlement terms were read out loud. Financial penalties. Mandatory training for any future board members. Independent oversight for a set period. A written acknowledgement to all residents admitting the HOA had no authority over water utilities. Full rescission of retaliatory violations. Reimbursement of legal costs. The HOA president looked smaller with each line. He asked if this would be public. The city lawyer said yes. That question alone told everyone in the room what he'd cared about most. The agreement was signed before sunset. That evening, the email went out. Not from the HOA. From the city. It outlined the findings. It outlined the penalties. It confirmed the HOA's lack of authority. It included a statement acknowledging harm to residents and warning of further action if violations occurred again. No spin. No softness. Just facts. The group chat didn't explode this time. It went quiet in a different way. A satisfied way. People didn't need to vent anymore. They'd been heard. I sat on my porch as the sun went down, water running inside like it always had, feeling the strange calm that comes after a storm you didn't ask for but refused to hide from. There was only one thing left. Consequences tend to have echoes, and the HOA hadn't heard the last one yet. The consequences didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. They arrived quietly, the way real endings usually do. The morning after the city's email went out, the HOA office didn't open. No sign on the door. No explanation. Just locked glass and an empty parking lot where the compliance officer's car used to be. By noon, someone noticed the payment portal was offline. By evening, another notice appeared on the door, this one legal, this one final, stating that all association operations were temporarily suspended pending restructuring under city-mandated oversight. Temporarily, in this context, meant indefinitely. The board dissolved within 48 hours. Not formally at first. Just evaporated. One resignation posted. Then another. Then silence. The president sent a last email thanking everyone for the opportunity to serve and asking for privacy. No one replied. Privacy is hard to grant when your actions have already been documented, archived, and circulated. The city appointed an interim administrator. Not someone from the neighborhood. Not someone interested in politics. Just a professional whose job was to untangle messes like this without caring who lost face in the process. Her first act was to freeze all enforcement. Her second was to order a full audit of HOA finances. That was when the real damage surfaced. Fines that never made it into operating accounts. Legal fees paid to firms no one remembered approving. Administrative charges, routed through shell vendors that existed only on paper. It turned out water hadn't been the first time the HOA had tested how much authority people would accept without asking for proof. It was just the first time they'd done it with something people couldn't live without. The compliance officer resigned officially 2 days later. No statement. No defense. Just gone. Word filtered through the neighborhood that she'd been advised not to speak publicly while investigations were ongoing. People stopped speculating. Speculation was unnecessary now. The facts were doing all the talking. My lawyer called one final time to tell me the city had closed my part of the case. The violations were rescinded permanently. My legal fees were reimbursed in full. The city thanked me formally for cooperation. He asked if I wanted to pursue additional civil action. I thought about it longer than I expected. In the end, I said no. Not because they didn't deserve it. Not because it wouldn't succeed. But because the lesson had already landed harder than any lawsuit could. The HOA had lost its authority, its leadership, its credibility, and its illusion of control. Everyone knew why. Everyone knew how it started. With water. The neighborhood changed after that. People talked to each other more. They read documents. They asked questions at meetings, the few that still happened under oversight. They didn't assume someone with a badge or a title knew what they were doing. Trust became something earned instead of expected. As for me, I went back to normal life. Normal showers. Normal mornings. Normal evenings where the most dramatic thing was deciding what to cook for dinner. Sometimes I'd catch myself listening to the sound of running water a second longer than necessary, just to remind myself how quickly something ordinary can become leverage in the wrong hands. The city never pressed criminal charges. They didn't need to. The administrative penalties were public. The findings were permanent. The HOA's name became shorthand for what not to do in training sessions for other associations. That kind of reputation sticks longer than any fine. A month later, a new interim board sent out its first message. It was short, clear, almost painfully humble. It acknowledged past overreach. It promised transparency. It invited residents to participate in rebuilding something functional instead of performative. It ended with one line that made me smile despite myself. Water utilities remain under exclusive city control. That was it. No drama. No spin. Just a boundary finally respected. I never set out to dismantle an HOA. I just wanted to finish my shower. But when someone decides they can turn essentials on and off to force obedience, they stop being an annoyance and start being a problem. Problems don't disappear when ignored. They disappear when confronted, documented, and dragged into the light where authority has to prove itself. The water never went out again. And the people who tried to own it learned the hard way that power you don't actually have is the most dangerous kind to pretend to wield.